you, President Park. It's an honor to be here, to be part of this panel of distinguished thinkers, and I look forward to their comments and to your questions. And Professor Kim, it's a pleasure to be working with Korea University as well in this, what is the 9th year of this 5-university collaboration. So it's an honor to be here and to be at this Institute for Advanced Study. I do come from Princeton, and across town there we have the Institute for Advanced Study, which, as the president said, was the model for this institute. And it's interesting, the very first senior fellow or faculty member at our institute was Albert Einstein. And of course, he was the father, you might say, of the technology that we're grappling with today, nuclear energy. But he also was, in his latter years, a serious student of politics, and among his many efforts were collaborations with the atomic scientists, who formed a kind of cohort of scientists during the research period of World War II, pushing forward an agenda for arms control and disarmament. So it's in that spirit, and it's quite appropriate that we're here at the Korean Institute for Advanced Study. I think there's wide agreement that the crisis with North Korea is becoming more dangerous. Everyone agrees that the situation is alarming. The president said it's not just a conundrum, it's a catastrophe, and I think we all agree with that. The dangers have grown in recent weeks and months for a major miscalculation, for possibility of war, and it's probably more of that sort, a tinderbox for violence, more of that sort than we've seen for decades. The core of the problem is remarkably, even stunningly simple. North Korea is determined to become a nuclear state, a nuclear power, and the other countries in the region are determined that they don't become such a power. Therein lies the difficulty. As North Korea continues to build its capability, it unleashes more and more tension and threat across the region, and increasingly in the United States. It creates new and more complex ways in which the countries from South Korea, Japan, China, the United States and Russia, and the wider world thinks about this threat. And indeed, from the perspective of the U.S.-South Korean alliance, as North Korea gains a greater capability to threaten to attack North America with an intercontinental ballistic missile tipped with a nuclear weapon, it creates a vibration in the alliance by provoking thoughts of divisibility of alliance interests. That will the United States be a patron of the alliance and live up to its guarantee of extended deterrence, or will there be these moments where the U.S. sees the threat different from the way the South Korean partners see the threat? And so this becomes, with every day, a greater possibility. Indeed, the Trump administration has explicitly said if diplomacy fails, they will act to eliminate the threat. What that means, the circumstances of that sort are not clear, but clearly they have signaled emphatically, more emphatically than you could imagine, that the use of force is still on the table. Listen to Lindsey Graham talk about this in his characterization of what he thinks the president means when he says this will not stand, that this has to be a threat that will be eliminated, not lived with. Most of the U.S. national security establishment has started to make a transition from seeing North Korea as a proliferation problem, and increasingly it is seen as a deterrence problem. But the Trump administration is not there yet, and it's not clear that they will be there. The crisis is further inflamed by the personalities and behaviors of leaders in the region, not least North Korea and perhaps from my country, new leaders, ones that are not necessarily experienced, that may have more so than the predecessors a kind of risk-prone behavior, more willing to think about extreme cases and think outside of the box and not necessarily gravitate to cautious management of the problem. There are very few leaders in the region that we would describe as Bismarcks or Gorbachevs or Reagans or Obamas. Such leadership is in short supply. Trump, indeed, President Trump has unfortunately undermined some of the moral high ground that I think the United States and the wider set of countries looking at North Korea have commanded over the decades in talking about, in quite dramatic language, unleashing fire and fury, the likes of which the world has never seen, and threatening to totally destroy North Korea. So there is a kind of a looseness of talk, a kind of rhetoric, a kind of personalization. It's me against him that is not creating circumstances that reduce tension and create possibilities for management. And of course, the wider situation also is making matters difficult because, as I think the President also said, we're in the midst of a wider regional transformation, what I have described as a transformation from a hegemonic order to a more traditional, partially at least, balance of power order, which requires very different calculations, different kinds of diplomacy, and certainly a lot of efforts to manage power shifts and look for new equilibriums for security cooperation in the region. So that we seem to be coming to a turning point. We can see different futures in front of us. We can see one, perhaps a last chance for a nuclear deal, setting the stage for a wider regional arms control effort. Or on the other hand, we could see even short of a war, which of course could happen, we could see a nuclear-armed North Korea that persists, that destabilizes the region, provoking the Republic of Korea and Japan to talk about and think about the nuclear option themselves. So there's a lot at stake here, and time doesn't necessarily mean that it will be on our side. But can we think, going forward, about managing this problem? If the problem can't be solved, no one has a silver bullet. Can there be steps that can be taken to manage the problem? Here's where I would say there is some good news, and that good news is that the international community is remarkably unanimous that North Korea and the Korean Peninsula should be free of nuclear weapons. There have been 16 United Nations Security Council resolutions that have set down the law on what we expect North Korea to do. All the great powers, China, Russia, the United States, the Europeans, Japan, South Korea, agree on the vision that there should be a region that should be free of these capabilities that North Korea is building. The bad news is, of course, that North Korea does not seem to be willing to bend to pressure, although more pressure certainly could be and should be applied, but unresponsive to carrots and sticks. So in my view, we need to slow down a little bit here and play for the long term. Various people have said strategic patience has failed. We've got to find a solution. That's dangerous in my view. We should rather be thinking about recalibrating what I would call a strategy of persistence, strategic persistence, containing the threat, playing for time, reducing tensions that can feed miscalculation and risk-taking. The key, in my view, is to shift the dynamic from a North Korea versus the US, or even more pernicious, Kim Jong-un versus Trump, to a wider region and a wider regional response to North Korea. Keep the denuclearization goal always alive, never give up. So it seems to me that there are three thoughts that would follow from this view about how we might make fumbling efforts, at least, to make some progress. One is simply to pursue options using all the instruments that we have available to us. This would include deterrence, to make it clear to North Korea that having nuclear weapons is not necessarily going to make your day. It's difficult, it's risky, there are demands that the outside world will be, and that every nuclear power that has ever come into being has had to, in effect, implicitly agree that they are in cooperative relationships with the outside world to prevent those weapons from being used. Deterrence, containment, containment along all these different dimensions of containing the spread of technology, containing the influence of North Korea, sealing North Korea up, if you will. Sanctions, number 3. Sanctions have to be pursued with increasing vigor, including more work from China. Keep a nuclear North Korea in a box. Limit their international exposure, prevent WMD from leaking. But sanctions have to be understood as the way the international community has seen them for almost 2 centuries now. The idea of sanctions emerged really in the 19th century, in large part with the international peace movement, looking for instruments short of war to put pressure on behavior that threatens war, that threatens aggression, and tools with sanctions that can be pursued without the use of war. So sanctions are a friend. Dialogue, talk is not something, it's not a concession. And then finally, continue to talk about the off-ramp. Yes, there's going to be more pressure on North Korea. Yes, all the options are on the table, but there's always going to have to be someone who is making clear to North Korea that there is an off-ramp, there is an option. The old bargain that I remember Secretary of Defense Perry pursued and articulated at the end of the Clinton administration, that there is a chance that North Korea can live peacefully with its neighbors. It entails denuclearization on its part in a phased, verifiable way that will include reciprocity of extending more normalized behavior from those that live around North Korea. So pursue those options. And just very quickly, secondly, push for a G5 approach. The multilateral front needs to be reactivated. It may not be a bargain that the Russians and the Chinese have offered, a freeze for a freeze, but experiment a little bit. Take some risks on the side of diplomacy. Suggest not a freeze for a freeze, because that's a concession on North Korea not to do something that's illegal for the United States and Korea to do something that is legal, namely to engage in military exercises that are there precisely because North Korea is doing what it's doing. But you can make steps. We do 2 exercises a year, do 1 a year and see what happens. Nothing might happen. They might continue the test, but it gives you the moral high ground that you are looking for signals of a kind of security dilemma solution where you make reciprocal gestures and see what the other side does. And finally, very quickly, lay the foundation for a wider settlement in the region. Make the other states in the region stakeholders in a regime of deterrence and containment and sanctions by continuing to talk about what the region could look like. The topics that our group has been talking about amongst ourselves, the 5 university dialoguers for 9 years now, looking for ways to think creatively about security cooperation, assurances coming in all directions about what a more peaceful and non-nuclear peninsula would look like, and thinking again the way we did when the 6-party talks were in operation. They were abandoned in 2009, of architecture, a Northeast Asian security architecture. That puts everybody on one side and North Korea on the other. And that's the kind of leverage that, in the long run, I think can solve this problem peacefully. Thank you.